Hi, everybody. Welcome. My name is Paul Golan. I'm executive director of the Society for Humanistic Judaism, and this is episode one. We are kind of relaunching our rabbis and cantors learning series with a Torah learning series, the Parsha of the Month Club. As you may know, um, there is a tradition of reading a portion of the Torah every week in the traditional Jewish denominations. Some of you may have read one for your bar bat mitzvah, as I did. I can't remember which one I did, though, sadly. I'd have to go look it up. That's how powerful and meaningful it was for me. However, even though we are humanistic Jews, there is still great value we can derive from our written texts and traditions. So we thought we would provide a more focused theme throughout our year as we do this monthly program. Most of you may have been with us the last couple of years where we've done a program where rabbis and cantors kind of spoke about a whole variety of topics depending on what they chose. This narrows it a little bit, but as you may know, if you've done any kind of Torah learning, you can draw any kind of themes out of what the Torah portion is in most cases. So I'm excited to hear what our various rabbis come up with. So today we're honored to be hearing from Rabbi Mary Beth Raskin. Rabbi Mary was ordained by the International Institute for Secular Humanistic Judaism and is the immediate past president of the Society for Humanistic Judaism. She's the founding rabbi of Cultural Synagogue in Portland, Oregon, and was the 2024 recipient of the Sherwin T. Wine Lifetime Achievement Award, which is the highest honor we have in our movement. And I can tell you firsthand, she officiates a mean bar mitzvah. Um, and I highly recommend it to anybody who has a young student. So I will first of all put a spotlight on you, Mary, and then turn it over to you.
Okay. Hello, everybody. It's great to see you. I'm looking forward to talking about my interpretation of a particular Torah story. I also want you to know that I'm still thinking about it, and I hope you will share your ideas about the story. Okay. The story is about Abraham and Sarah laughing when they were told they will have a child when they are 190 years old, respectively. This story falls within two different parshas. The Abraham story is in Parsha Lech Lecha, meaning go forth, found in Genesis 12 to 17, and it was read on November 1st. The Sarah part of the story is in Vayera, meaning and he appeared, found in Genesis 18 to 22, and that was read on November 8th. I chose to talk about the laughter of Abraham and Sarah because their story has made me laugh many times. It's also a story that's made people I tell to laugh or at least smile. And this is no matter their age. I mean, really, do you believe that a 100-year-old man and a 90-year-old woman could have a child? I think the ancient Israelites laughed also. This story is at least 3,000 years old, let's say. Are the minds and bodies of the Israelites, the ancient Israelites, so different from ours that they would take this story as true? I think not. So if Abraham and Sarah laughed, and I'm assuming the ancient Israelites laughed, I laugh, and my contemporaries laugh, why did the ancient authors make this a humorous story? So to begin to understand the story, we need to explain humor in the Bible and the nature of humor. So here's what we know about humor in the Bible. It's a literary technique that the ancient writers were familiar with. Humor is found throughout all three books of the Bible. So as an example, if you go to the Jewish Publication Society Study Bible, they list comic, farce, irony, parody, puns and punning, riddles, sarcasm, and satire in their index. Writing systems and written documents were well developed at the time of, excuse me, of the earliest Israelites in the late second millennium. Hammurabi's code had been written 500 years earlier. The Epic of Gilgamesh, which we know as the flood story, was already a classic story. The early Israelites were also familiar with native Canaanite religious practices, such as those found on clay tablets. Biblical topics such as prayer, prophecy, and concern for the poor and oppressed were common in the literature of the region. Various types of humor also included in the literature in the area. Mesopotamian literature included humorous stories, parody, satire, and a specific character may have been a professional man who was the butt of jokes or a man who entertained others with jokes. I think we can find the common person in that. Their word for laughter, specifically laughter with a sexual connotation, was sahu. By biblical times, the word sahu had become two words, sachak, with a sadi in the front, meaning laughter and sex, and sahak, beginning with a shin or sin, which also meant play, and that's current in Hebrew today. Sachak, with laughter and sex, is the basis for the laughter of Abraham and Sarah, and also Isaac's name, Yitzhak. So, what about humor itself? What makes a story humorous? The ancients knew, as we know today, there is a physical component to humor. Whether we laugh or smile, nod or shake our heads, we respond physically to humor. And why is this important? Because unlike prose or, let's say, a list of kings and their descendants, a physical response helps us remember the story. Humor has a physical response that is enjoyable. We like humorous stories or jokes, and we retell them. These physical responses to humor in a story wake us up mentally. They help us to remember the stories, characters, and ideally, underlying serious and important messages. The humor in the biblical text was intentional. The writers wanted their stories to be remembered because the stories had messages they wanted preserved. So before we explore the message of Abraham and Sarah's laughter, let me tell them to you. A short note before I begin. I find it interesting to note God's specific name, whether it's Elohim or Yahweh, and so you will hear both in the following stories. So here's Abraham's story. In the beginning of chapter 17, Elohim appears to Abraham and says, "Walk with me." During their walk, Elohim says, "I will make you exceedingly fertile and make nations of you." Elohim goes on to say, "As for your wife Sarah, I will bless her. Indeed, I will give you a son by her. I will bless her so that she shall give rise to nations. Rulers of people shall issue from her." At this, Abraham threw himself on his face and laughed as he said to himself, "Can a child be born to a man 100 years old? Or can Sarah bear a child at 90? Elohim continues, "Nevertheless, Sarah, your wife, shall bear you a son, and you shall name him Isaac. And I will maintain my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his offspring to come. By my covenant, I will maintain with Isaac, whom Sarah shall bear to you at this season next year." And with that last pronouncement, Elohim was gone from Abraham. Here is Sarah's story at the beginning of Genesis 18. Abraham was sitting at the entrance of his tent when Yahweh and three men show up. Abraham, a wonderful host, has a meal prepared to serve these important guests. After being served, they asked about his wife Sarah, and Abraham responded that she was in the tent. Then one of them said, "I will return next year, and your wife Sarah shall have a son." Sarah was listening at the entrance of the tent, which was behind him. Now, Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in years. Sarah had stopped having her periods. And Sarah laughed to herself, saying, now that I've lost the ability, am I to have enjoyment with my husband so old? Then Yahweh said to Abraham, why did Sarah laugh, saying, shall I in truth bear a child, old as I am? Is there anything too wondrous for Yahweh? I will return to you at the same season next year, and Sarah shall have a son. Sarah lied, saying, I did not laugh, for she was frightened. Came the reply, you did laugh. All right. We do have a happy ending to the story, and this occurs in Genesis 21. Yahweh took note of Sarah as promised, and Yahweh did for Sarah what had been announced. Sarah conceived and bore a son to Abraham in his old age, at the set time of which Elohim had spoken. Abraham gave his newborn son, whom Sarah had borne him, the name of Isaac. And when his son Isaac was 8 days old, Abraham circumcised him, and as Elohim had commanded him. Now, Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. Sarah said, Elohim has brought me laughter. Everyone who hears will laugh with me. And she added, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would suckle children? Yet I have borne a son in his old age. Here's a brief review of the kind of humor found in this story. The immediately obvious type is exaggeration. The exaggerated ages of Abraham and Sarah signal the impossibility of them having a child. Their laughter at the news that they will produce such a child serves to draw our attention to this exaggeration. There's a farcical scene when Sarah imagines herself having sexual relations with Abraham. She speaks of being weathered and wonders about having enjoyment with such an old guy. This scene added depth when considering the ancient meaning of tzachak to mean laughter and sex. The use of pun or wordplay is when God tells Abraham that he will name his son Yitzchak, which means he laughs. And there's irony in the happy ending to this story. No one would have thought that such an elderly couple could have delivered a son, but they did. And now Sarah laughs with joy instead of skepticism. God has brought her joy, and whoever hears the story will also laugh with joy. Now, in interpreting a Torah text, we must avoid the risk of using a modern perspective, especially identifying jokes that may not have been intended by the ancient writers. And I think in general, this is sound advice. In this case, I think we're on firm ground. The types of humor I just mentioned can be found throughout the Bible. We need to consider something else when interpreting this story. The ancient writers used verbal exchanges between God and the Israelites to promote the message of God's power and divine will. This specific story shows that God is powerful enough to cause an elderly couple to produce a child. The larger importance of the verbal exchange is God's promotion of Abraham as the first of the people Israel and the covenant between God and the Israelites. The ancient storytellers used humor to wake up the ancient listeners to the wondrousness of God and the covenant they have with God because of Abraham and Sarah. A modern person might laugh at the absurdity of an elderly couple having a child. I'm thinking an ancient person might smile knowingly and nod at God's power. I believe that it is human to laugh at the absurd. Sometimes the world is so chaotic that it's unfathomable, and our only response is to laugh and to move on in the best ways that we can. Humor can help us see the absurd, and as a result, we can laugh at what is incomprehensible. The ancient writers knew the possibility of an elderly couple having a child was absurd. Their intention was to use humor to enable the ancient Israelites to understand the power of God and to accept this absurd and incomprehensible event as divine. Now, I've always enjoyed this story because I laughed each time I imagined Sarah being told she would have a child at 90 years old. This humor appealed to me in a very literal way. I can appreciate the practical implication of what it would mean to have a child at 90 years old. Yeah, think about that one for a while. However, I began to think about something different as I prepared this talk. Abraham and Sarah faced an existential threat. If they had no children, there would not be any Israelite people. They must have felt great despair. I now think that the humor that allows us to see and laugh at the absurdity in our world is an antidote to despair. Positive physical laughter dispels that despair and perhaps allows us to eventually move to hope. At a minimum, I think we can agree that it's better to laugh than to cry. Thank you.
That was great. Thank you. It's a new perspective for me and I really appreciate it, especially considering how proud I am as a humanistic Jew of the modern tradition around Jews and humor and comedy. To think about that it is kind of baked into our religious tradition as well is a cool new perspective. So thank you for that. We are just going to open it up to folks to give reactions and feedback and ask questions. Um, Rick Gold, yeah, if you can put your hand up either with a Zoom icon or wave frantically if you don't know how to do that, and I'll try to see you. But go ahead, Rick.
Yeah, thanks. So this story reflects uh, a faith in science, actually, from that time period. That, it's not the scientific method, but there were things that could be done and things that couldn't be done. There were facts and there were miracles. And so people laughed because this was a miracle, which was so outside of their perspective. But the story was written in a way to show that perhaps there really is a God, and whether or not Abraham and Sarah actually existed is another issue.
So, Rick, to your point about the science part, as I was writing this early on, I almost talked about how I think the joke might be on us moderns, because with the ability through science to harvest and save eggs and sperm, it is actually a reality that a 90-year-old woman and a 100-year-old man could have a child, of their of their egg and sperm. So I didn't work it into my talk, but I have to tell you, I was thinking about it.
Bruce.
Um, for me, there's a lot of metaphors, at least, that pop up into my head. And I realize in listening to this, there's a continuum between whether how much of this is a literal interpretation that existed at that time versus how much is metaphorical at this time. But I also wonder how, at a time when maybe longevity averaged about 30 years, what would be the meaning of older age. So a couple of things that popped into my head, and I realized Mary's saying I have to be cautious to interpret that from a mindset in the 21st century. But I was thinking, one, that if the average age was 30 years old back then, based on some of our study of history and disease, people living to that age could metaphorically be a story about hope. And I know I'm 75 and my wife is 74, and we laugh about, oh, wouldn't it be wonderful to have our 100th birthday party together? And what would we do? And so we use that laughter to address maybe our natural existential fear of dying and leaving each other. So I wonder how they may have used the idea of living longer than expected and how it might have affected their ability to find hope, and even how it might reflect on how they their relationships and how they felt about death and longevity. So that's one of the things I was focusing on. And the other idea was their relationship to the perceived impossibility, and how do we, from a humanistic perspective, how do we address impossibility? Do we just abandon it, or do we embrace audaciousness as part of humanism? So that's another thing that popped into my head.
So I love your interpretation of hope. I think that's, as you were speaking, I thought that's absolutely there. Um, and I like the perspective, that hope of living a long age, to an older age. And yeah, I really like that you have hope baked into that too. Um, I was looking at the the laughter part, and the how laughter can dispel despair, the physical part of deep laughter. But yes, I think I like that idea of including hope in that also. Yeah.
One of the cool things for me as I think about this notion that humor was built in, perhaps, or probably on purpose, is how today politically there are many people in the US who are deeply invested in the idea that the Bible must be taken literally. I mean, there's a billionaire who built a Noah's Ark according to the specifications. I don't know the if you know about the Ark experience. I forgot which state it's in. Is it Tennessee? I forgot where it is. There's this beautiful irony because they had to close it because of heavy rains. But it's this whole investment that no, we must take this literally. And then when I think about that, not just was it metaphor, which of course is the retort that reasonable people provide, but that it actually that the joke is on them, that it's actually so I'm thinking about like the talking donkey, right? Like that certainly, was perhaps not just a metaphor, but actually a joke. And that, they have to be invested in, well, of course, God is powerful enough to make a donkey talk, but like, can't you just see that it was humor, and that this is now a 3,000-year-old joke that is still being played on people who are taking it literally. So that is really helpful perspective for me.
So one of the things I was thinking about as I was doing this talk was throwing out a blessing for all the comedians, whether they're late night or stand up or old Jews telling jokes or Yiddish jokes or even jokes coming out of the Holocaust, because that does too. And I'm sure that all of you uh, have your favorite jokes or your favorite comedian or just shows that you like plugging into. Early on when we were all logging in, I mentioned that I live in Portland, Oregon, and there's been such a rising of comedy and playfulness in my city as a result of ice coming. And the ice building we have in Portland, it's pretty small, and even the people who are protecting it is a relatively small group of people, and the protesters are relatively small. 20, 25 people out there. So it's been built up into the news as this really horrible thing. And I actually avoided going by there because I thought, oh, right by the ice building, it must be pretty bad. Well, one evening I had my granddaughters with me and I wanted to go. I said, let's go to a restaurant before we drive home so we can miss the traffic. And there's a restaurant nearby there called Spaghetti Factory. Okay. So we drive along. I take a right-hand turn down this, it's like a 3-block street. I take the turn, and the first block, I'm there. I can't turn around. I realize I'm in front of the ice building. And I'm like, oh my God, I'm in front of the ice building. I see the protesters. I see the police or whoever they are on the other side. And all I can do is drive through. And there were so few people there. I mean, I was shocked because even I, who lived here, thought it must be horrible around there. So we drive the 2 more blocks, we go to the restaurant, and I thought, oh, they must be losing business with all this. By the time we left, the restaurant was packed, and I'm driving out, and there's still on the right-hand side now, because I'm going the opposite way, there's like 20 protesters, and they're dressed up in these inflatable costumes, and they're all waving at us, so we wave back and drive off. And the videos that are being posted now are just so funny with all these people in inflatable costumes. And then yesterday I saw one. I have a neighbor who's the leader of a gay chorus, and they had the gay chorus out there, and it was kind of rainy, so they were had plastic on, and they're singing songs from the '60s, and and that's what's going on here. So Bruce, when you visit Portland, you might drive by, you might not, but it's not as scary as people may think. And and this is the kind of humor that I took from this story, that there's we don't have to be bogged down by all the chaos maybe or absurdity in the world, that we have a response to it, and it can get us past that. So that's my Portland story.
There's a couple of comments in the chat. Hildegard wrote about a article in this past Sunday's New York Times cover story of a woman now around 70 years old who continues to have children, initially through in vitro fertilization. Later, she used donor eggs and a surrogate. There are court cases, etc. Maybe we are getting closer to a 90-year-old person having a child. But I think that the humanistic angle, of course, is that the miracle is coming from science, not God, but it is certainly, but and then, there is lots of other ethical questions that are raised about a older person. I mean, I consider myself a pretty old dad, frankly. My parents, who are my stepdad's 88 and my mom is a couple of months away from 80, and 2 years ago they bought a dog, and there's my stepdad said I this dog may outlive me, and it's like this. I mean, that's not humor, that's kind of serious, but there is both the joy. I mean, they got a dog both because um I refused to, and my kids were asking for it. So then they did it. That's what grandparents are for. And just because it brings joy, right? So there's all kinds of, I think, interesting ethical questions as well about kids and age. Like when I do the math for myself about where I will be when my kids graduate college and maybe get married or maybe have kids of their own, I start to see big, scary numbers. So, I think there's a lot of interesting questions around that. Judy.
So I think about laughter as being a really important tool for humans to move on. I mean, you can have a physical, emotional release from laughter that enables you to live through, tolerate, get past all sorts of adverse events. And I just, as you talk about not taking the story literally, and the prospect that, and I don't know the backstory of what was happening before this story, so because I don't know my Bible stories at all, but if they had been really worried about the future of the people and hadn't conceived, and it was really burdening them, and assumed that they really were 90 and 100 years old, that they may have felt like they were 90 and 100, but for those days, maybe it was 30 and 40 or 40 and 50 even, and that there are incidents of women still conceiving at those ages. Not common, but does happen. And maybe that lifting of despair, that lifting of anxiousness through humor enabled them to move on. I don't know. It just makes me think about the power of laughter. And because I can remember so many times for myself when I have been really burdened by things that are happening in my life, I have a really good laugh, and it's like I feel like a new person. And it can have physical effects. So anyway, so that's what brings to my mind.
I'll do a brief comment and then David. So just a little more of the backstory. Before Isaac was born, Sarah was so worried about Abraham not having a child to start this huge people. She had her maidservant, Hagar, produce a child with Abraham, who is Ishmael. And when Isaac was born, Abraham went to God and said, well, what about Ishmael? Well, and Sarah, after Isaac was born, kicked Hagar and Ishmael out of the family and sent them into the desert, or Abraham did. But anyway, that's what Sarah wanted. She wanted Ishmael and Hagar out of the picture and told Abraham, they got to go. And Abraham said, okay. And, because a happy wife is a good thing, right? But Abraham argued with God, well, what about Ishmael? He's my son. And so, anyway, it all works out well. Hagar and Ishmael go into the desert and God takes care of them and they produce a great people. But I think it speaks to the existential threat. And we know people today feel that way also about wanting to have children. And so the importance of having a child, I think, was definitely felt, at least by the biblical writers, that this was an important topic they had to address. So, and I think David was.
Just a very brief comment about humor. Humor can be a wonderful part of your life, and especially when you get old, and then humor helps you cope with aging. And even Shakespeare knew that. And the reason I know that is when I was 80, my daughter put together a collage of family photos, and on the bottom, in big letters, she put a quote from Shakespeare: "With mirth and laughter, let old wrinkles come." And my modern version of that is, hey, humor helps you cope with old age. Okay.
I 100% agree. I have a friend who, for the last, I don't know, 10, 12 years or so, as we've aged and issues come up, we call each other intentionally and complain about whatever we're going to complain about. And then we laugh. And that's the whole, and we even talk about it. Okay, I got to complain about this, but we're going to laugh afterwards. And we always do. So that's a great quote from Shakespeare.
Yeah.
Jody.
So, Mary, what a wonderful talk. You have set the bar very high for those of us who are going to give our own talks during this series. So thank you for that. A couple of quick comments. One is when we read the text, and I am no Hebrew expert. Okay, I want my cards on the table. I read things in English. But what happens when we read the text, right, is we lose the humor part because Yitzhak is translated as Isaac, right? So we lose the meaning of his name being laughter. So there's that component. And then I think that there's also, and I wondered what you think about this, there's also a certain irony in his name, because when we move on, his life is anything but humorous. I mean, he is the one that Abraham is prepared to sacrifice, right, in the story of the Akedah in order to prove his faith to the biblical God. And then he's sort of known as the silent patriarch. He doesn't really act in an active kind of way. He's the one who is tricked, if you will, into giving the birthright to Jacob instead of Esau. So there's not a lot in his life that makes us laugh. Except for his name, right? And so the biblical writer, it almost seems to me, might be setting us up, like a MacGuffin in Hitchcock, right? We're going to give him this name, and we're going to start him with all of this joke about him and humor and laughter, but just you wait.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. I mean, I've heard him referred to as kind of a nebbish, like he didn't really do much, and his father wanted to kill him, and Isaac isn't a character that any of us would want to be. So as you were talking, I wanted to let you all know that as I read the story to you, it's a direct translation from the Hebrew. So, I used Elohim and Yahweh when the Bible did. So we know that the story comes from both the Elohim tradition and the Yahweh tradition. And the language is very simple. So when I tell the story, I've taken the literal Hebrew translation and it's the Sepharia translation that I use. And I guess what I found interesting, the Sepharia translation, as I'm reading it to you, and this is their translation, it sounds very modern to me. And when I look at the Hebrew, it tracks. So I just wanted to give you that perspective that when I was telling the story, I was literally reading the English translation. I didn't change it at all.
There's also a technical question in the chat, which I don't know if you or anyone here can answer, is where do the E and J texts overlap and diverge in the story? And I know enough to know that's a reference to the four main authors of the Bible that, biblical scholars in modern times have kind of identified different voices of different writers of the Torah. And it's not just four, there are multiple, but there were four main ones. And I forgot the name of the author who gave them these letter designations. Someone here probably knows that. And I do think it's kind of an interesting question. Like, was there one of the main writers who was funnier than the other? So we can kind of trace the humorous stories to that one writer. I don't know, but it's in the it's David Finkel asked it in the chat, and I just wanted to bring it up.
Yeah, I can speak to that. And David, your question is why I always include whether it's Elohim or Yahweh, because I just find that distinction interesting. So the Abraham story is from Elohim, and the Sarah story is from Yahweh. And the ending of the story, where Isaac is born, that text goes back and forth between Elohim and Yahweh. And that I found more interesting than here's the Elohim version and here's the Yahweh version. But at the ending, when Isaac was born, in the Hebrew text, it goes back and forth. So that's what I found interesting. But yeah, you'll find throughout Genesis, the two versions. My understanding is Elohim were the Israelites that lived in the north, and Yahweh were the Israelites that lived around Jerusalem and in the mountains. And anyway, how those stories are different, and then how they play together, I find it really interesting.
Milton?
I have read uh, a number of different translations, but this is the first time I've heard of a translation that uses the different names of God. Can you can you on chat write down that translation? Because I'd like to read that one.
Ah, just look up. I use Sefaria,
S
Sefaria,
E. I'm sorry. S.
SEF is in Fred,
Uh-huh.
Aria. Thank you, James. And if
It's
you go to, yeah,
it's
just go to
online.
yeah, Sefaria.org text.
Thank
And
you.
Paul put it in the chats, and you can go to Genesis 12 or 7, go to Genesis 17.
Thank you.
Uh, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, they're actually a very interesting organization. I knew the guy who kind of got it off the ground, and I did not think it was a good idea at all, which shows you how much I know because it's actually used across all of Judaism, including Orthodoxy. It's a great source. They have everything. And it's all, this guy, this is 20 something years ago. He was like, everything is going online. We need to put our texts online. And he got pushback for it. Like, no, you've got to have it in book form. But and I think if you go as you go through it, there's like hypertexts for comments and other versions, and so it's really deep. So hopefully that will be a good resource for you.
What I love about it is um, every Hebrew sentence in the text is translated. So it's not like you have a whole paragraph of Hebrew and then a paragraph of English. It's each sentence. So for me, I'm looking for the Elohim and the Yahweh in the text because in English, there are two different words, but we don't catch it. Like one is God and one is Lord. And, in English and in our common language, Lord, God, it's all kind of the same. We don't draw a distinction. But in the Hebrew, it's very definitely there. So just because somebody asked about this, and it's one of my favorite topics, if you go back to Genesis, the very first Genesis story is an Elohim story. There was the first day and the second day, and it said it's very organized and very balanced. And then by chapter 2, there's this news story that says, oh, yeah, all that got created. And then there was the Garden of Eden. And they go into this big story about the Garden of Eden. So the first is an Elohim story. The Garden of Eden is a Yahweh story. And so they're very different interpretations of the creation story. Anyway, so that's one of the reasons I love looking at that.
It makes it hard to claim it was all written by one divine author, but okay, I'll stop harping on that. Um, Other thoughts, questions, anything else? Bruce again, go ahead.
I just have one thought. Um, you know, when I think about stories, I think about not only what the story is, but why is a story being told? And I think we're talking about that. And I'm under, for me, the why is not only about the inner psychology and circumstances of the writer, but it's also the intended audience and what do they need. And so it's kind of interesting as I think about this, and I know Mary was mentioning the current amplification of a story in Portland, it's very interesting how different audiences, based on their, I guess, where they are social psychologically, how they will interpret it literally or whether they'll interpret it metaphorically, and how stories can serve many different purposes among both the author and the audience.
very good point. Excellent point. Especially, the situation I brought up in Portland is so extremely political that you can find all sorts of stories based on the message that various people want to send. Yeah.
Anyone else want to jump in before we wrap up? Great. Well, thank you so much, Mary.
Wait, since we're getting ready to wrap up, I have one last hope for everybody. Uh, I hope that my storytelling or this story of laughter will encourage you or inspire you to take a new look at the biblical stories, that they're actually pretty interesting and can be fun and may not be as dry as you may have been taught when you were younger. So anyway, thank you. It's been fun for me too.
Awesome. Thank you. With all of these, we do post the recording to our YouTube channel. If you want to rewatch or send someone to watch, because I see a request for a written copy. I don't know whether Mary has it all written out, but if so, maybe we could also post it to the SHJ blog. So then we can provide the written piece as well. But the recording will be up on YouTube in a few days. Hopefully you're getting my constant contact emails. I usually send them out Saturdays at 4 p.m. Eastern. So I will have the recording, a link to the recording in that email. And again, one thing I forgot to say at the beginning that I always say is this is a members exclusive. It's a thank you for those of you who are members of our affiliated communities or independent members of SHJ directly or donors or supporters. Thank you so much for being a part of Humanistic Judaism. It really allows us to help share this thing that I think is pretty special and that we believe in, and that shows we can keep doing Jewish. We can keep looking at our holy texts and interpret them in new and fascinating ways. So thank you again, everyone, for being here. Thank you, Mary, and everyone have a great day, and we'll see you again next month.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Paul.